My name is Paul Bidmead. One day, I hope to be a journalist. But not just any journalist. A journalist that lives by the self-evident truths that everyone is created equal. A journalist who embraces diversity and doesn't just paint minority groups with one big brush stroke. Many of Australia's 281,578 Muslims, 1.5% of the total Australian population, believe that as a result of media bias, they are vilified in society as terrorists and discriminated in the workplace.
Many Australians have been shocked by the recent protests of Muslim youths in Sydney who reacted to a YouTube clip mocking Islamic prophet Muhammad. A provocative cartoon also appeared in a Danish newspaper showing a Muhammad-like figure wearing a turban shaped as a bomb with burning fuse coming out of it. The cartoon read, "Stop, stop, we have run out of virgins."
Christian Australians may never understand the Muslim riots, but instead they should remember the advice of Atticus Finch in the famous novel To Kill a Mockingbird. If you can learn one simple trick, you'll get along better with all kinds of folk. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it.
Both the Cronulla riots and the Muslim riots have led to conclusive evidence that Australian multiculturalism is in crisis mode. It seems even when the media is trying to promote multiculturalism, it cannot break the habit of evoking fear when representing Muslims.
On Channel 9's 60 Minutes, Michael Usher did a piece about how multiculturalism is working in Australia. Yet, how is showing a menacing woman wearing a burqa in front of the Australian flag going to promote multiculturalism?
Others believe it threatens our national identity. It seems right now nothing divides opinion like multiculturalism. Our government insists it's working here, a shining example for the rest of the world. But in some countries, like Britain and Germany, they've declared multiculturalism a failure, a disastrous social policy that's torn communities apart. But let's be frank here. This debate isn't so much about race as religion and a fear of one in particular, Islam.
Islamophobia, that is, the fear of those who practice the Islamic religion, was at its highest during the Howard Bush era. When George Bush and John Howard declared a war on terrorism, they created an us versus them mentality.
In 2001, John Howard launched the Help Protect Australia from Terrorism campaign. Australians were instructed to call a terrorism hotline if they suspected any suspicious behaviour.
This seemed to give Australians a licence to label every Muslim a terrorist. The media got mixed up with their role, when all that was needed was to highlight any dangerous areas for Australians to travel and report on extremist terrorist attacks. Journalists went that bit further. I guess this leads to my next question. Have the values and ideals which the likes of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi been left to die by the wayside? Like many Australians, I have never experienced what it's like to be a part of a minority. Today, I speak to someone who does. Sahar, it's a privilege to have you.
Thank you.
Now tell me, what's it been like to growing up in Australia as a Muslim?
Well, considering my appearance, I haven't had too much trouble growing up as a Muslim. I've always been surrounded around Australians, so for me personally, I haven't had any trouble and have grown up quite happily around non-Muslims.
Now tell me a little bit more about your parents' background and where you've been.
Well, my parents came to Australia in '92, just the year before I was born. They were born in Lebanon as Palestinian refugees and grew up there with the help of such programs as the United Nations Relief Work Agency, which my dad also worked for growing up in Lebanon. And then they moved to Vienna, where he also worked for the United Nations before he came to Australia.
Now I understand that you work for Mad for Peace. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Mad for Peace is an organisation founded by Jill Hicks, a survivor of the London bombings. She lost both her legs due to a suicide bombing by an Islamic extremist. Our work is to pretty much educate people about non-violent ways of combating conflicts and dealing with conflicts in a non-violent manner.
Now what was your reaction to the YouTube video that mocked Islamic prophet Muhammad?
Personally, I have seen it and I did find it offensive, but instead of reacting in a outrageous way, I went and wrote an article telling people how to deal with such mockings and stuff like that.
Yesterday was the 10th anniversary of the Bali bombings, where 88 Australians tragically lost their life in a devastating terrorist attack. It is the survivors of terrorist attacks that teach us why peace is so important. If journalists continue to misrepresent Muslims and continue to evoke fear in Australians, it is the terrorists who win. Through solidarity, we can work effectively to create a world in which everyone can have their voice heard and every precious life can be valued.
Today, using the 19th century principle of peace journalism, I plan to shed light on conflict and promote peace initiatives.
Peace journalism. It is defined as a choice when editors and reporters make choices of what to report and how to report it. They can create opportunities for society at large to consider and value non-violent responses to conflict. The real way to win this war on terrorism is through non-violent responses. The responsibility starts with the press, uniting Australians through the accurate representation of all Australians.
I'm joined here with Ron Hernig, a journalism lecturer at the University of South Australia. Ron, do you think that the media has a responsibility to promote peace when reporting on conflict?
I think the media has a responsibility to help the community understand more about conflict and why it happens. And I guess it has a responsibility to encourage a more cooperative understanding of the way the world operates.
Sure. And what do you think that the best way to do that is?
That I'm not exactly sure of. I think one thing is to not promote so that where of course the media often concentrates on conflict, it should spend a little more time concentrating on the consequence of interactions between people, so that it's not just these are the bad guys and these are the good guys, but these are people and we need to understand where they're coming from, and we need to understand where they're coming from in a more detailed and less biased way than we think at the moment.
Sure. Now, do you think that the media falls into the trap of linking extremists like the Taliban to the Muslim religion?
The Taliban represent an extreme form of Islam, so the media are kind of correct in that way. But I think the media, I think that different parts of the media do it in different ways, but I think there should be more emphasis on ordinary Muslims living in the community, providing a sense of an understanding of who they are and how they practice their religion, and how that's not necessarily negative with regard to what we like to call Australian values.
Sure. Now, do you think that if the media showed a more positive side of the Muslim people, do you think that that would lead to a more accurate representation of Muslims in Australia?
I think it would certainly lead to a more balanced representation, so that you wouldn't just be focusing, for example, on the events in Sydney a few weeks ago. You would be looking at the diversity of the community, just as when you focus on Anglo reality, you're not just showing mad parties and drunken binges, you're also showing a diversity of ways in which white Australians behave. So it's really important that the Australian community of all ethnicities understand that the Muslim community is as diverse as every other community here. So yes, it's the media's responsibility. It's difficult because we have a conflict notion of news, but I think it is a responsibility to provide a more balanced view of cultures operating in our society.
I took to the streets of Adelaide to find out what Adelaideans' preconceptions of Muslims were and how the media has possibly influenced it. Excuse me, do you have any preconceived ideas about Muslims?
Not really, no. I'm from Melbourne, or I live here now in Adelaide, but my next door neighbours were Muslims. Delightful people.
Delightful people. Now, do you think that the media represents Muslims accurately?
I don't think I take much notice, really, of the media. I sort of tend to switch off when it comes to racist things and what have you.
Some Adelaideans are even completely over this negative media campaign.
It certainly supports what the terrorists are trying to do. They want our media to do that. They're trying to drive a wedge between non-Muslims and the Muslim world, to the detriment of everybody, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I think they're okay, and you know, just as long as they don't bother me, I'll be all right.
Sure.
You know?
And do you think that the media creates a negative stereotype of Muslims?
I think I do.
This documentary was filmed the day after the 10th anniversary of the Bali bombings. Still fresh in Australians' mind, I wanted to set out to investigate whether Australians had preconceived ideas of Muslims based on the negative coverage in the media. I gave all passers-by the opportunity to share their view, but only 3 people agreed to speak to me. All 3 interviewees agreed that there was a negative bias. Yet what does this say about the others, too scared to share their view?
It seems that multiculturalism in Australia is an uphill battle.